Thank you, Kirsty. So I wonder how that was for you, what might have come up for you during that experience, and what you received from God. So I just encourage you to stay with it throughout the rest of the morning. Let it sink in, and as Kirsty says, we'll have an opportunity to maybe hear from a few of us and share in a little while. So as I mentioned earlier, we're experimenting with different formats on a Sunday morning, and on this fourth Sunday, the format is Ancient Practices. Lectio Divina, which we've just partaken in, is from the monastic tradition, which dates back to the 6th century. We'll also be speaking the Apostles' Creed together later on, and that has its roots in the 4th and 5th century, and the Eucharist, or taking bread and wine, of course, goes back to the Last Supper just before Christ's death and resurrection. So why are these ancient practices relevant in 2021? And why are we, as Community Church Edinburgh, choosing to emphasize the importance of them on one of our monthly Sundays? Well, I'm hoping just over the next 15 minutes or so to offer a few thoughts on that, why I think they're valuable, and also why I think they're particularly relevant in this moment in time that we find ourselves in. I wonder if you have ever seen a time-lapse video of a sunflower. If you have, you'll notice that the head of the sunflower is always directed towards the sun, and so it moves from east to west in the northern hemisphere as it tracks our closest star. Now, the sunflower implicitly recognizes the sun as its source of life, and it orients itself towards that which is of greatest value. And I believe that that is true for us too. I think we orient ourselves and we move towards that which we value. And we see in the story of Mary and Martha, which we just reflected on, these two different orientations. Mary and Martha had different values. Their attention was on different things, and so they oriented themselves in different directions. We orient ourselves and move towards that which we value. So what I want to ask this morning is just a simple question to you, is what are you orienting yourself towards? What is it that you value? What are you giving attention to? In the past 20 years, we've seen an incredible change in our culture. We've seen the rise of the internet and globalization. You know, our 21st century world is flooded with just immediately accessible products and information. So I wonder if there's ever been a time in history when the competition for your attention has been as fierce as it is now. I came across a quote which I thought illustrated this quite nicely. It was a few years ago from the CEO of Netflix. In an interview, he shared who he thought the main competitor of Netflix was. I wonder if anyone actually would hazard a guess. Feel free to shout out who you think the CEO of Netflix thinks their main competitor is. Okay, well, that's it. It's a more commonly known story than I'm aware of, but it's sleep. I was like astounded when I heard that. It's not another rival company, but it's actually sleep. And I would suggest to you this morning that there are powerful forces and huge incentives that are vying for your attention. One of the things which gets a lot of my attention is podcasts. And these days, you can find a podcast about absolutely anything. It's remarkable. I enjoy listening to them when I'm walking or doing the dishes or driving the car. And there's something about, as well as the content and the interest, about the conversational nature of them. For me, it's that sort of feeling like I'm in a room with friends having an interesting discussion. But over time, I've begun to realize that when I have time available and don't have a podcast on, I can feel the urge, I can feel the absence, the gap and the urge to fill it. And there's always something to fill it with. There's just so much content. So it takes some discipline for me to leave some space, just to be with my own thoughts, maybe listen to some music instead, or spend some time praying. I sense in me that inherent urge to consume, and there's just so much to consume. But it's also a way of avoiding the challenges in my life, avoiding some of the uncomfortable feelings I might have, some of the creative work I could be doing, or making myself available to other people. I've become concerned, if I'm honest, about my relationship with podcasts, and so I'm trying to make some changes. So one of the things I've done is I've removed a lot of podcasts from my app, which, the ones that kind of filled the space rather than the ones I really, really enjoyed and loved. And I've bought a few audiobooks instead and trying to consider in advance what is it I want to give my attention to listen to, that will nourish me, that I love, but often maybe don't feel like listening to in the moment. And one of those audiobooks is actually, wait for it, the Bible. I've often thought about trying to read the Bible in a year, and I have tried a few times in vain. But now I've got an audiobook of the Bible. It feels like it sort of unlocked it for me. Now it helps that it's read by David Suchet, Hercule Poirot himself. So it's a really beautifully recited version. It's got Psalms and Proverbs, Old Testament and New Testament every day. And if I'm honest, I'm a bit surprised that I've stuck with it now for a month or so. And some parts are not that stimulating. But for the most part, I've found it really nourishing and helping me to deepen my understanding of the Bible and an appreciation of this book, which has been handed down through generation after generation and is such a major part of our inheritance as Christians. We all orient ourselves towards something. We all give our attention to something, to many things. So what is it that you're giving your attention to? I really loved what Amy Milligan shared a couple of weeks ago, and it's nice that she's here to hear this morning from Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. See, Paul, who wrote this letter to the Philippians, he understood that what we give our attention to is really important. It shapes who we are and who we are becoming. I find these words in this letter incisive in a world in which we can give our attention to practically anything at the press of a button. I think this is really crucial wisdom for us in our time. As I've been reflecting on these ideas of attention and orientation over the last couple of weeks, I've often wondered why I find it so difficult. Why is it so difficult to give my attention to the things I know are good for me and to avoid the things that are not necessarily nourishing or good for me? And I think part of the reason is because it really goes against a prevailing current in our culture. I think there's obviously loads we could say about our culture and how it shapes us, and it was great hearing what Tom shared this morning about that sense of being shaped by knowing ourselves as made in the image of God. But two things which have stood out to me as I've reflected on our culture are the values of freedom on one hand and productivity on the other. These are two values I think our culture holds up on a pedestal and prioritizes. And in the context of these two values of freedom and productivity, it doesn't make that much sense spending time worshiping God, giving our attention to God. Freedom would say, I don't feel like it, I'd rather do something else, and what I want to do is the most important thing. And productivity would say, my to-do list is long, I can achieve more by spending time on something else. But I think when we see these values placed on a pedestal in our culture, we also need to ask ourselves where they lead. Where are they taking us? What is the result of a freedom which says I'll do what I feel like whenever I want? Is it an atomized society where families are broken up and extended families spread over huge geography, an individualistic society in which we're swimming in acquaintances but lacking deep friendships, an epidemic of depression and loneliness? And what's the result of a rampant productivity, overflowing email inboxes? That's one for me. A never-ending to-do list and always something new to consume. Is this what is leading to a widespread anxiety, stress, and exhaustion? Our culture will orient itself and move towards that which it values. So perhaps it would be wise for us to ask ourselves, are we oriented to the values of our culture, or is there something greater which we can direct ourselves towards? You see, I think when we orient ourselves towards God, and when we do that in community like we're doing this morning, and that's what these ancient practices are all about, we're acknowledging that we are not the center of our universe. And that is a stark contrast, I think, to a culture where we're encouraged to put ourselves front and center. When we worship as part of a body, we realize our individual freedom and our success isn't paramount, as advertising likes to continuously tell us. These ancient practices help us to reposition ourselves. I think they do that in two ways. Firstly, by recognizing that there's something and someone greater than us. And secondly, by doing so in solidarity and alongside one another. Coming to church and worshiping God may to you be something that's normal and you've done for a long time, but I would suggest to you this is actually really quite radically countercultural in 2021. And I wonder if in a world in which with the COVID pandemic, in which feelings of isolation, loneliness, and mental health crisis have grown, whether more and more people will begin to realize the value of what it is that we're doing. When we worship, we are directing ourselves towards the highest good. It's not a man-made value like individual freedom or productivity, but it's a person in Jesus Christ who embodied the full extent of self-sacrificial love. And we saw that in the image of Mary sitting at Jesus' feet in the story that we just heard. Once I started to think about the importance of this idea of what we give our attention to and how we orient ourselves, it just struck me how prevalent it is throughout Scripture. You know, the Bible is full of contrasts, of guidance on one hand and warning on the other, in the stories and parables and Proverbs. And as Kirsty said earlier, it's often about how to live and how not to live, how to orient ourselves, how to direct ourselves in the world. We could think of the story of Cain and Abel, which is something that I spoke on a couple of years ago, which if you're interested in looking at that further, you can probably find online. There's a contrast between King David and King Saul, the prodigal son and the older brother, building your house upon sand or building it upon a rock, as Rupert spoke about a few weeks ago. There's so many contrasts in the Gospels of various broken people who wholeheartedly admit their need for Christ, in contrast to the Pharisees and the teachers who believed they had the answer. And of course, the story of Martha and Mary, which we looked at this morning. In these examples, we're shown a broad path and a narrow path. And there are common threads that we can learn from. Humbling ourselves, offering the sacrifice that we have, in other words, the life that we've been given, and worshiping God with our whole hearts. These ancient practices which we're taking part in today are here to help us to come back into alignment and relationship with God as an ongoing activity again and again. Just as the prodigal son returns to the loving arms of the Father. So what are we orienting ourselves towards this morning? What are we giving our attention to? What are we giving our lives for? Psalm 1, verse 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and its leaves do not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers. This psalm articulates the result of a life with attention directed towards God. It is firmly planted, fruitful and prosperous, and does not wither. I love the metaphor of a tree in this psalm. It's the perfect image. I've got an apple tree in our garden. It's 10 years old, although you wouldn't know to look at it because it's moved around a few times. And most years so far, we've only had a few apples from it. And for whatever reason this year, we've already had more apples from this tree than all of the other years put together. And I had a nice apple crumble last night to prove it. In 30 years, we're going to have more fruit than we know what to do with. And I'm looking at Joy here because she's got apple trees in her garden. And every autumn, she has more apples than she can give away. You know, partaking in these ancient practices coming back again and again into relationship with God, orienting ourselves to that highest good, is like a tree growing year after year, season through season, becoming stronger, roots going deeper, becoming mature. There may not be fruit for many years, but in time, there may be more fruit than you know what to do with. We orient ourselves and we move towards that which we value. So what is it that you value this morning? How are you orienting yourself, and what are you giving your attention to?